The moment the stagecoach door swung open in Willow Creek, Caleb Walker's hat slipped clean out of his hand. He didn't bend to pick it up. He couldn't move at all. "My wife can't be this beautiful," he said out loud right there in front of the whole platform like a man accusing someone of a crime. Clara Whitmore didn't blink. She looked him straight in the eye and answered calm as still water. "Too late, Mr. Walker. The papers are already signed." Neither one of them knew it yet, but that single sentence had just changed both of their lives forever. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and follow this channel so you never miss a single moment of Caleb and Clara's story. And down in the comments, tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every one of them, and I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it truly began. Caleb Walker had rehearsed this moment for 3 weeks, and none of his rehearsals looked anything like this. He'd imagined a plain woman stepping off that stagecoach. A tired woman, maybe. A widow with rough hands and no illusions about what marriage on a cattle ranch actually meant. He had imagined someone who wouldn't ask him to smile, wouldn't ask him to talk about the past, wouldn't ask him for anything he didn't have left to give. He had not imagined this. Clara Whitmore stepped down from that stagecoach in a traveling dress. The color of dark coffee and the whole platform in Willow Creek seemed to forget how to breathe. She had dark hair pinned back neat under her bonnet, and sharp green eyes that missed nothing, and a way of standing chin-level spine straight that made her look like she belonged in a parlor in Boston, not a dust-choked cattle town in Montana territory. "You're Caleb Walker?" she asked before he'd said a single word. He stopped, started again. "My wife can't be this beautiful." He said it like he was reading a mistake off a piece of paper. Like the agency had sent him someone else's bride by accident, and any minute now a man would come running to claim her. A few people on the platform actually laughed. Not unkindly, but laughed. Old Sam Denny, who ran the feed store, elbowed his son and muttered something about the luckiest fool in the territory. Clara's expression didn't crack. "I assure you," she said, "there's been no mistake. My name is on the contract. Whitmore, C-L-A-R-A. Would you like to see it?" "That's not," Caleb dragged a hand down his face. 12 years on that ranch had put lines there that didn't belong on a man of 34, and right now every one of them was working overtime. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean, Mr. Walker?" He looked at her, really looked, and something in his chest twisted so hard it almost hurt. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at him and waited for an honest answer instead of a polite one. "I meant," he said slowly, "that I asked for a plain, practical woman who wanted a working arrangement. Not," he gestured at her, at all of her helpless. "Not this." "This," Clara repeated, and for the first time something flickered behind her eyes, not heard exactly something closer to steel. Being tested. "Mr. Walker, I have calloused hands under these gloves. I can gut a chicken faster than most men twice my size. I grew up doing farm work you probably think a lady like me has never touched. Beauty was not something I put on that application. You put it in your head just now all on your own." Nobody on that platform said a word. Caleb felt his ears go hot. "I didn't mean it as an insult." "I know exactly how you meant it," Clara said. "You meant it as a problem." And there it was, the first mini-battle of a war neither one of them had signed up to fight, and neither one of them was backing down. 3 weeks earlier, Caleb had sat at his kitchen table with a single sheet of paper and a stub of pencil, writing the same 4 words over and over before he crossed them out. Someone to survive with. He'd crossed that out too. Too honest. Too much like admitting something. Old Pete Ruiz, who'd worked the Walker Ranch since Caleb's father was alive, had leaned in the doorway watching him chew through his 3rd attempt. "You're overthinking a mail-order bride letter, boss." "I am not overthinking it. You've been at that table 2 hours. I want to get it right, Pete." Pete had crossed his arms. "Get what right? You're not writing her a love poem. You said yourself practical arrangement. Ranch help. Someone to keep the house from falling down around your ears while you keep the cattle from wandering into the next county." "That's right. Then write that." Caleb had looked down at the paper like it owed him something. "I don't want some romantic girl showing up here expecting flowers and dancing. I don't have that in me anymore, Pete. Not since Sarah." Pete's face had gone soft in that way it always did whenever Caleb said his late wife's name, which wasn't often, not in 8 years. Not since the fever took her and the baby both in the same terrible week, and Caleb had buried them under the same cottonwood tree and never spoken about it again, except in silences that Pete had learned to read like scripture. I know what you don't have in you, Pete had said quietly. I've watched you not have it for 8 years. But a wife who can't stand to look at a hard-working, decent man because he's got nothing pretty to say to her, that's not a wife, Caleb. That's a boarder. You sure that's all you want? That's all I can afford to want. Pete had shaken his head slowly. Fine, write your letter, but I'll tell you this much. The good Lord's got a real particular sense of humor about men who plan out their whole lives on a sheet of paper. Caleb hadn't laughed. He'd finished the letter that night, practical, plain, unromantic. He'd asked for a hard-working woman, someone quiet, someone who wouldn't need things from him he no longer had to give. He had not, in 3 weeks of waiting for a reply, once imagined a woman who would stand on a train platform and dismantle his first sentence to her in under a minute. The wagon ride back to the ranch was quiet in the particular way that meant it wasn't quiet at all. It was loud with everything neither one of them was saying. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap, spine still straight, watching the land roll by like she was memorizing it. Caleb kept his eyes on the horses and his jaw set like a man bracing for weather. You're angry, Clara finally said. I'm not angry. You've said 4 words to me since we left town. I'm thinking about how to send me back. Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. Is that what you think this is? I think, Clara said, and her voice had an edge, now careful and controlled but sharp underneath, that you looked at me on that platform like I was a problem you hadn't budgeted for. I think you're wondering right now whether a woman who looks like this is going to be coughed or spoiled or gone within the month when she realizes what ranch life actually costs a person. Caleb didn't answer right away. That silence told her everything. I grew up in Ohio on a farm that failed twice before it failed for good, Clara said, quieter now but no less firm. My father drank away what the drought didn't take. I raised my 2 younger brothers from the time I was 14. I have plowed fields, Mr. Walker. I have delivered a breech calf with my own 2 hands at 15 years old because there was no one else to do it. I did not answer a mail-order bride advertisement because I am delicate and helpless and looking for a rescue. I answered it because I am done being poor and done being pitied, and a fresh start on a working ranch sounded a great deal better than staying in a town where everyone already knows exactly who I am and exactly what they think I'm worth. The wagon hit a rut. Neither of them noticed. I didn't know any of that, Caleb said finally. No, Clara agreed. You didn't ask. You just decided I couldn't possibly be what you needed based on my face. Mini climax number 1 and Caleb Walker had lost it before they had even reached the front gate. The ranch house came into view. Weathered gray wood, a barn that leaned a little more than it should, fences that had seen better decades. Caleb watched Clara take it in and braced himself for disappointment. It didn't come. It's a good property, Clara said, studying the layout with an assessing eye that had nothing girlish in it at all. That barn roof needs work before winter, though, and your north fence line is sagging. I can see it from here. You're losing grazing land to the Miller boundary if that's not fixed soon. Caleb blinked at her. You can tell that from a wagon seat. I told you, I know farms. That night, Caleb lay awake in the room he'd cleared out for her, the room that used to be Sarah's sewing room, the room he hadn't set foot in for 8 years until 3 days ago, and listened to the unfamiliar sound of another person breathing in his house. He didn't know yet that this was only the beginning of every assumption he'd made, getting knocked flat one by one. She was up before him. Caleb came downstairs the next morning, expecting to find her still asleep or lost or crying quietly into a strange kitchen, the way he'd half expected any city-mannered bride to do on her first morning in the territory. Instead, he found the coffee already made, the fire already stoked, and Clara Whitmore standing at the stove in a plain work dress with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, cracking eggs like she'd been doing it in this kitchen her whole life. Morning, she said without turning around. There's coffee. I found your flour was near Spoiled Weevils. I threw it out, and I'll need to buy more when we're next in town. Caleb stood in the doorway like a man who'd walked into the wrong house. You've been up how long? Since before sunrise. I don't sleep past first light. Never have. I usually start the coffee. You don't have to anymore. She finally turned spatula in hand, and there was something almost daring in the look she gave him, like she knew exactly what he was thinking and had decided to make him say it out loud if he wanted to fight. Unless you'd rather I not be useful, unless you'd rather I sit in the parlor and look decorative, since that seemed to be your concern yesterday. That's not fair. Isn't it? Caleb opened his mouth to argue and found he had nothing. He sat down at the table instead and ate the best breakfast he'd had in 8 years and hated how much that unsettled him. So, by the end of the first week, Caleb had stopped being surprised that Clara could work and started being surprised by how much it bothered him that she could work so well without needing him at all. He found her in the barn on the 6th morning, sleeves rolled up, wrestling a length of fence wire into place with a determined set to her jaw that he was starting to recognize meant, "Do not offer to help unless you want your head bitten off." "You don't need to do that," he said anyway, because apparently he hadn't learned. "I'm already doing it. That wire's heavy gauge. It'll bite through gloves that thin. Then I'll get better gloves." She grunted, hauled the wire taut, and secured it with 3 quick, practiced emotions that told him this was not the first fence she'd ever mended. "There, your north line won't be sagging come the first snow." Caleb crossed his arms, half annoyed, half something he didn't have a name for yet. "Where'd a farm girl from Ohio learn to string wire like a ranch hand?" "The same place I learned everything else. Nobody else was going to do it." She straightened, pressed a hand to the small of her back, and looked at him with an expression that had gone unexpectedly soft around the edges. "You keep waiting for me to be a burden, Mr. Walker. I don't think I'm going to give you the satisfaction." "I never said burden." "You didn't have to say it. I've seen the look on your face every time I finish a chore before you expect me to. It's not gratitude. It's suspicion." He didn't deny it, and that more than anything was its own small, quiet mini-climax, the first crack in his armor that he let her see. The storm came up fast on the 9th day, the kind of sudden black sky weather that Montana Territory was famous for, and it caught both of them a half-mile from the barn, with the horses spooked and the wind tearing at everything that wasn't nailed down. "Get inside," Caleb shouted over the thunder, already fighting to catch the lead rope of the gelding that had reared and torn free. "I'm not leaving you out here alone with a panicked horse." "Clara." I said no. The gelding bolted straight toward the fence line, and Clara was moving before Caleb could stop her, cutting across at an angle no green rider would ever have thought to try, matching the animal's line instead of chasing its tail. She caught the trailing rope on the second grab, dug her heels in, and let her whole weight drag against the horse's momentum until it finally furiously slowed. Caleb reached at her seconds later, chest-heaving rain plastering his shirt to his back. "That was reckless. That was effective." Clara shot back, breathless, her bonnet long-gone hair coming loose in wet strands around her face. "You're welcome, by the way. You could have been trampled. So could you if I'd stood on the porch wringing my hands like you clearly expected me to." Lightning cracked somewhere close, and for one unguarded second, standing in the pouring rain with a spooked horse between them, and both their hearts still hammering, Caleb Walker looked at his wife and felt something he hadn't let himself feel in 8 years. Not gratitude exactly, not yet love, but something dangerously close to both. "Where'd you learn to catch a runaway horse like that?" he shouted over the wind. "The same place I learned everything else," Clara shouted back. And for the first time since the platform, she was laughing, actually laughing. Rain running down her face, triumphant and alive. Nobody else was going to do it, Caleb. It was the first time she'd said his given name instead of Mr. Walker. Neither one of them mentioned it on the walk back to the barn. Neither one of them needed to. It sat between them the whole soaked, shivering way home, warm as a coal nobody wanted to admit they were carrying. By the time they got the horses settled and stumbled into the kitchen, drenched and half-frozen and grinning despite themselves, Pete took one look at the two of them from his spot by the stove and said nothing at all, just raised an eyebrow and went back to his coffee, smart enough not to comment on whatever he'd just watched change between his boss and the woman he'd been so sure would never last the season. That evening, over a supper she'd cooked without asking him what he liked, Caleb finally asked the question that had been sitting in his chest for a week like a stone. "Why'd you really answer that advertisement, Clara? A woman who looks like you, who can work like you do. You could have had your pick of husbands back in Ohio. Men with money, men with manners. Why come all the way out here to marry a stranger who insulted you on the platform inside of 10 seconds? Clara set down her fork slowly. Because in Ohio, she said, every man who ever looked twice at me looked at my face first and asked about my dowry second, and neither one of those things is who I am. My father drank us into debt and died owing half the county money, and every family with a son my age knew it. I was the pretty Whitmore girl with nothing behind her but scandal and empty pockets. Nobody wanted a wife. They wanted a story to feel sorry for or a face to show off or both. And you thought a rancher in Montana Territory would want different. I thought a rancher in Montana Territory who specifically asked for a practical woman who specifically said he didn't want romance or distractions might actually let me be useful instead of decorative for the first time in my life. Her voice cracked just slightly at the edges, and she pressed her lips together like she was angry at herself for letting it show. I didn't come here for love, Mr. Walker. I came here to finally be worth something besides a pretty face on someone's arm. Caleb sat very still. I understand that, he said quietly, better than you'd think. For the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, something eased in Clara's shoulders. It wasn't trust yet, but it was the beginning of it, and Caleb felt the ground shift under a plan he'd built very carefully to never need anyone again. Not everyone on the ranch came around so easily. Jed Tolliver, the youngest of Caleb's two hired hands, made his doubts plain the very next morning when he caught Clara sorting through the tack room, checking every strap and buckle with a practiced eye. Ma'am, best leave the tack to the men. Wouldn't want you ruining good leather. Clara didn't look up. This bridle's stitching is coming loose at the cheek piece. Another 2 weeks of hard riding, and it would have snapped on somebody likely at a full gallop. Would you like me to show you where, or would you rather learn the hard way when a horse bolts out from under you? Jed's face went red. I've been mending tack since before you got here. Then I'm sure you'll fix it twice as fast as I could. Clara finally met his eyes, not unkindly, but without an ounce of retreat in her either. I'm not here to take anyone's job, Mr. Tolliver. I'm here to make sure this ranch doesn't lose a man to a saddle that should have been mended a month ago. If that offends you, I'm sorry for it, but I won't apologize for noticing what needed noticing. Caleb, coming around the corner of the barn in time to catch the tail end of it, watched Jed's jaw work like he wanted to argue and couldn't find the ground to stand on. She's right, Jed, Caleb said quietly. Fix the bridle. Jed looked between the two of them, some private calculation working behind his eyes, and finally ducked his head. Yes, sir. Later, alone in the barn, Caleb found Clara still going through the tack with the same relentless thoroughness, and something in him, some old stubborn wall he'd built brick by brick over 8 lonely years, cracked just a little further. You didn't have to defend yourself to him like that, Caleb said. I'd have backed you regardless. I know. Clara didn't look up from the strap in her hands. But I've learned the hard way, Caleb, if a woman doesn't stand up for her own worth the very first time it's questioned, she spends the rest of her life waiting for someone else to do it for her. I'd rather not wait. Caleb thought of 8 years of silence, of a locked drawer full of Sarah's letters. He'd never once let himself reread of every wall he'd built to keep from ever needing anyone's rescue again, and understood watching her that he had just married someone who might finally teach him the difference between needing no one and needing the right person. It was Pete who brought the first warning 10 days in finding Caleb alone at the corral fence in the gray hour before full dark. Folks in town are talking, Pete said without preamble. Folks in town are always talking. Not like this. Pete leaned on the rail beside him. Ruth Denny's been telling anyone who'll stand still that it's peculiar a woman that beautiful, that capable coming all this way just to marry a rancher. Nobody in 3 counties could get to the altar. Says it doesn't add up. Says a woman like that must be running from something. Caleb's jaw tightened. Running from what? Nobody knows. That's the trouble with gossip, boss. It doesn't need to know anything to spread. She told me herself. Her father drank the family into ruin. She wanted a fresh start. I believe you, Pete said. But belief's not the currency this town trades in. And there's another thing. He hesitated, which for Pete was as good as a shout. Victor Hayes rode past the north fence yesterday. Slow, real slow, like a man taking inventory. Something cold moved through Caleb's chest. Victor's got no business on my north fence. He's got no business, Pete agreed, but he sure looked like a man building himself some anyway. Neither of them said the rest of it out loud that a wealthy neighbor with his eye on Walker land and a beautiful new bride the whole town was already whispering about was a combination that never stayed quiet for long. But they were both thinking it, and the sun went down on that unspoken fear like a held breath. Bah. The next morning on a supply run into Willow Creek, the postmaster called out to Clara before she'd even reached the counter. "Mrs. Walker got something for you." Old Mr. Abernathy shuffled through a stack of letters with the unhurried curiosity of a man who read every return address that passed through his hands, whether it was his business or not. "Come all the way from Ohio. Forwarded twice, looks like first to your old boarding house, then here. Fellow's got fine handwriting for a man." Clara's smile didn't waver, but Caleb, standing just behind her with a sack of flour over one shoulder, saw her spine go rigid as a fence post. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy," she said, and took the letter, quickly sliding it into her coat pocket before anyone could read the name written above the Ohio postmark. Caleb hadn't seen the name, but he'd seen how fast she'd made it disappear, and that told him plenty. "Everything all right?" he asked once they were back out on the boardwalk. "Everything's fine." Clara's hand stayed pressed flat against her coat pocket the entire walk to the wagon, like she was holding something down that might otherwise come loose. Just an old friend keeping in touch. An old friend? Yes. Must be a good friend to write a woman 2,000 miles from home. Caleb. There was a warning in the way she said his name, now quiet but unmistakable. Not everything needs explaining the same day it happens. He let it go for now, but the question sat in his chest the whole ride home, heavier than the flour sack in the wagon bed, and he found himself watching the shape of that letter through the fabric of her coat pocket, more than he watched the road. The gossip found Clara directly 3 days later in Willow Creek's general store, and it did not come gently. Ruth Denny cornered her by the flour barrels with a smile sharp enough to cut leather. "Mrs. Walker, or is it Mrs. Walker? Yet I heard the wedding was rather hurried." "It was exactly as hurried as any mail-order arrangement is expected to be," Clara said evenly, not looking up from the sugar she was measuring. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Mrs. Denny." "Oh, nothing at all. It's just a woman like you, dear. So lovely, so capable, they say. Makes a person wonder why you'd travel 2,000 miles to marry a man you'd never met when a face like yours could have had its pick back east." "Perhaps," Clara said, setting down the scoop with deliberate calm, "a face like mine got tired of men back east who cared more about the face than the woman behind it. Perhaps I wanted a fresh start somewhere. My worth would be measured by my work instead of my looks or my father's debts. Is that so hard to believe, Mrs. Denny? Or is it simply more interesting to you if it isn't true?" The store went dead silent. 2 other women near the counter suddenly found the shelving fascinating. Ruth Denny's smile thinned to nothing. "No need to take that tone. No need to pry into a stranger's private business instead of flour barrels either," Clara said. "But here we both are." She paid for her sugar, thanked the clerk politely, and walked out with her spine straight and her chin high, and it wasn't until she was halfway down the street out of sight of the store window that her hands finally started shaking. Caleb, waiting with the wagon, saw the crack under the armor before she smoothed it back into place. "You heard?" she asked, climbing up beside him. "I heard enough. I didn't do anything wrong." "I know that." "Then why does everyone act like I did?" Caleb didn't have an answer for that. He just flicked the reins and let the silence carry them home. And somewhere in that silence, something in him decided quietly without fanfare that he was done letting this town talk about his wife like she was a puzzle to be solved instead of a person to be respected. It was the first time he'd called her, even in the privacy of his own head, his wife. The church social that Saturday was the first time the whole valley saw them together as husband and wife, and Caleb had half a mind to skip it entirely until Clara told him flatly that skipping it would only prove Ruth Denny right. "If we don't show our faces," she said, tying her bonnet with sharp, decisive movements, "every whisper in that store becomes gospel by Sunday morning. I won't hide, Caleb. I've spent my whole life being talked about behind closed doors. I'd rather be talked about to my face where I can answer back." So they went, and the whispers started the moment their wagon rolled up. Women leaning together near the lemonade table, men exchanging glances over the horseshoe pit, Ruth Denny's voice carrying just a fraction too loud about some people marrying above their station. Caleb felt his temper climb with every step toward the churchyard. Clara felt his arm tense under her hand, and to his shock laced her fingers through his instead of letting go. "Smile," she murmured, barely moving her lips. "Let them see nothing's wrong. Give them nothing to feed on." I don't know how to smile through this kind of thing. Then follow my lead. She walked them straight toward the lemonade table, straight toward Ruth Denny herself, and greeted her with a warmth so genuine sounding that Caleb almost believed it himself. Mrs. Denny, I've been meaning to ask that quilt pattern in your parlor window, the star one. Did you piece that yourself? I haven't seen work that fine since I left Ohio. Ruth Denny, caught flat-footed by simple kindness, where she'd been braced for a fight, actually flushed with pleasure. Why, yes. Yes, I did. It's beautiful. I'd love to learn the pattern sometime if you'd ever have a mind to teach me. By the end of the afternoon, half the women who'd been whispering about Clara that morning were clustered around her instead, trading recipes and asking after her Ohio kin, and Ruth Denny herself had gone from cold suspicion to something almost like grudging respect. Caleb watched it happen from across the churchyard, stunned. You just disarmed the whole town with a compliment about a quilt, he said later, helping her up into the wagon. I told you. Clara settled her skirts, allowing herself the smallest, most satisfied smile he'd seen on her yet. I know how to survive people who've already decided to hate me. It's one of the only advantages of a hard life, Mr. Walker. You learn every single way a person can try to hurt you, and you learn to be faster. Caleb laughed, really laughed for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, and something in Clara's chest eased at the sound of it, warm and unguarded, before she remembered the letters still folded small and hidden at the bottom of her travel trunk, and the smile faltered just slightly at the edges where he couldn't see it. Victor Hayes came to the ranch himself 4 days after that, riding in on a horse worth more than most men's entire herds, with a smile that had gotten him a great deal in this territory, and a handshake that had gotten him even more. Caleb. He swept his hat off with a flourish, clearly meant for the woman standing on the porch behind him. And this must be the new Mrs. Walker. The whole valley's talking about you, ma'am, and I can see now they haven't exaggerated one bit. Mr. Hayes, Clara said, polite and cool as a closed door. I came by neighborly. Victor went on, turning back to Caleb with the easy charm of a man who'd never once in his life been told no and meant it. Wanted to make a fair offer on that north parcel again. Water rights included. Generous price, Caleb. More than fair. Not selling, Caleb said, same answer as last spring. Circumstances change. Victor's eyes slid just briefly toward Clara. A man's got more to think about now than just himself. A wife. Maybe a family coming. Wouldn't hurt to have some cash set by, would it? Especially a wife as fine as this one. Woman like that's used to finer things than a struggling cattle spread, I'd imagine. Ohio wasn't it. I hear Ohio society's a bit more refined than what we've got out here. The insult was wrapped in silk, but it was an insult all the same, and Clara heard every layer of it. I find the honesty out here quite refreshing, actually, she said sweetly, even when it comes dressed up as flattery, Mr. Hayes. Victor's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went flat and calculating for just a moment before he covered it. Sharp, too. Caleb, you landed yourself quite a catch. He put his hat back on. Offer stands whenever you come to your senses. Give it some thought. He rode off at an unhurried pace, exactly like a man who wasn't worried about being told no twice because he was already planning his third approach. Caleb watched him go with his jaw set hard enough to ache. I don't like him, Clara said quietly. Nobody does. Doesn't stop him owning half this valley. He was testing you, watching how you'd react to him talking about me like that. Caleb turned to look at her, surprised. You caught that, Mr. Walker, Clara said. I spent my whole life reading men who smiled while they took something from you. Victor Hayes wants your land, and he's decided the fastest way to get it is to make you doubt what you've got worth protecting. It was the first time the two of them had stood on the same side of anything without an argument attached, and neither one of them quite knew what to do with how good that felt. That night, unable to sleep, Caleb finally told her about Sarah. He hadn't planned to. It came out slow over cold coffee at the kitchen table in the careful, halting way a man speaks about a wound he's kept bandaged for 8 years and isn't sure will bleed again if he touches it. Her name was Sarah, he said. We were married 4 years. She was carrying our first child when the fever came through the valley. Took her and the baby, both inside of a week. I buried them under the cottonwood out past the barn. He turned his coffee cup slowly, not looking up. I told myself after that I was done needing people. Needing people is how you end up standing over two graves wondering what you could have done different. I asked the agency for someone practical because I didn't think I had anything else left in me to offer. I didn't think I wanted anything else. And then you got off that stagecoach and I said the stupidest thing a man's ever said to his own bride, and you looked at me like I was a fool, and you weren't wrong. Clara was quiet for a long moment. I'm sorry about Sarah, she said finally. I'm sorry about the baby. I don't usually talk about it. I know, I could tell. She reached across the table, hesitated, then rested her hand lightly over his. It was the first time she'd touched him at all since the wedding vows. You don't have to be done needing people, Caleb. You just have to find people worth the risk again. He looked up at her then, and something passed between them that neither one was ready to name. Not yet, not with the ache of Sarah still sitting fresh between them, not with a whole town whispering outside their door. But it was there, unmistakable, a warmth neither one of them had expected to feel again. That was the moment later Caleb would come to understand as the true turning point. It was also the moment not 20 minutes later that everything came apart. He'd gone up to fetch an extra blanket from the cedar chest at the foot of Clara's bed. She'd mentioned the nights were colder than she was used to, and in pulling it free, something slipped out from beneath the folded quilts and hit the floor with a small metallic sound. A locket. Gold tarnished slightly with age, the clasp worn from years of handling. Caleb told himself not to open it. He told himself it wasn't his business that every person carried private things that Clara had never once pried into the locked drawer where he kept Sarah's letters. He opened it anyway. Inside was a small, painted portrait of a young man, handsome, fair-haired, maybe 22 or 23, and on the opposite face, engraved in careful script, 3 words that stopped Caleb's breath cold in his chest. Forever yours, William. Behind him, the floorboard creaked. Clara stood in the doorway, the color draining out of her face the instant she saw what he was holding, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach and told him the papers were already signed, Clara Whitmore looked unmistakably afraid. Caleb, her voice had gone very quiet. That's not what you think it is. Then tell me what it is, he said, and his own voice came out rougher than he meant it to, rougher than he had any right to, because they'd known each other 17 days, and he had no claim yet on jealousy. And yet something in his chest was breaking wide open regardless. Tell me who William is, Clara. Tell me why you're carrying another man's locket to your own wedding bed. Clara opened her mouth and closed it again. Her hands twisting into the fabric of her skirt, torn between 2 answers that both looked like they might cost her everything. Is he the reason you really left Ohio? Caleb pressed, and he hated how much he sounded like he was pleading. Is that it? You didn't leave because of your father's debts. At all, you left because of him. It's not that simple. Then make it simple for me, Clara. Because right now I'm standing here holding a stranger's face and his name carved next to the word forever, and my wife is looking at me like the ground just opened up under her feet. Because it did. The words tore out of her louder than she meant them, her composure cracking wide open for the first time since the platform. You weren't supposed to find that, not like this, not before I was ready to explain it in my own way, in my own time. So there is something to explain. There is always something to explain, Caleb. Everyone has a past, you included. You buried a wife and a child under a cottonwood tree and never spoke a word of it to me until 3 nights ago, and I didn't dig through your belongings to force it out of you. I waited. I let you tell me when you were ready. Was that so much to ask in return? That landed and landed hard, and Caleb felt the fight go out of his shoulders even as the fear stayed lodged in his chest like a stone. I'm not trying to hurt you, he said quieter now. I just need to know if there's a man out there somewhere who still thinks he has a claim on you. I need to know if I'm building something real or if I'm just a place you're hiding until it's safe to go back to him. Clara's eyes filled, and she blinked hard, furious at herself for it. That's not what this is. Then tell me what it is. I can't, she finally whispered. Not yet. Please, Caleb, not yet. Clara, please. Her voice cracked clean in half on the word, and for one unguarded moment, she looked less like the composed, unshakable woman who'd faced down Ruth Denny and Victor Hayes both without flinching, and more like a frightened girl standing at the edge of a truth she wasn't sure she'd survive telling. I will tell you everything, I swear it. Just not tonight. Not like this with it torn out of me instead of given. And in the silence that followed, with the locket cold and heavy in his palm, and the woman he was only just beginning to trust standing frozen in the doorway with a secret she wasn't ready to give him, Caleb Walker understood with a sick certainty settling low in his gut that the real story of his wife hadn't even begun. Orchestrated seamless narrative continuation with escalating drama, emotional reveals, and strategic plot twists. Orchestrated seamless narrative continuation with escalating drama, emotional reveals, and strategic plot twists. He didn't say another word to her that night. He set the locket down on the edge of the cedar chest, careful, like it might go off in his hands, and walked out of the room without looking back. Not because he wanted to punish her with silence, but because he didn't trust what would come out of his mouth if he stayed one more minute in that doorway. Clara didn't follow him. She stood there a long time after his footsteps faded down the hall, staring at the little gold locket sitting where he'd left it. And then she picked it up and held it so tight, the edges bit into her palm, and she didn't cry. She told herself she wasn't going to cry over a decision that had already been made years ago in a parlor 2,000 miles from here by people who weren't in this room anymore. Down the hall, Caleb lay on top of his blankets, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling, listening to a house that had never felt this big and this empty, even in the 8 years he'd lived in it alone. He kept turning the same question over and over, not who William was, not anymore, but why the not knowing hurt this much after only 17 days. A man wasn't supposed to feel robbed over a woman he'd married for convenience. He wasn't supposed to lie awake picturing another man's face painted small and careful inside a locket a woman had carried across 2,000 miles and hidden at the bottom of her trunk, like something too precious to leave behind and too dangerous to keep in plain sight. By the time the rooster started up, neither one of them had slept more than an hour. Pete noticed it before breakfast was even on the table, noticed the way Caleb moved around the kitchen like a man walking through a house full of broken glass, and the way Clara's good morning came out clipped and careful instead of warm. Something happened, Pete asked once Clara had gone out to the hen house and it was just the two of them at the table. No, Caleb. I said no, Pete. Pete studied him a long moment, then went back to his coffee because he'd worked for this family long enough to know when pushing did more harm than good. But he didn't let it go entirely. Whatever it is, he said, you'd do well to remember she's not the only one in this house carrying things she hasn't said out loud yet. Might be worth asking yourself if you'd have wanted somebody tearing your grief open before you were ready to hand it over. Caleb didn't answer that. He didn't have to. It sat in his chest all morning, like a splinter he couldn't work loose. They worked separately that whole day. Caleb out mending the same fence line Clara had already fixed, once finding an excuse to stay busy somewhere she wasn't, and Clara in the kitchen and the garden moving through her chores with the same relentless competence as always, except now there was nothing warm behind it. Just motion. Just a woman keeping her hands occupied so her mind had somewhere else to go. It was Jed of all people who cracked the silence without meaning to. You two have a fight, he asked Caleb, bluntly hauling a bale of hay past him toward the barn. That's not your business, Jed. Didn't say it was, just saying the whole ranch can feel it. Even the horses are jumpy. Jed dropped the bale and wiped his forehead. For what it's worth, and I know I gave her a hard time that first week, she's not what I figured her for. Whatever's got you two circling each other like strangers, I'd bet money it's not near as bad as you're making it out to be in your head. Caleb didn't answer, but that night after supper, eaten in near silence after Clara had gone up ahead of him, and he'd sat alone at the table staring at the dead fire, he found himself climbing the stairs anyway, not to demand answers this time, just to knock soft on a door that had been closed to him all day. Clara. No answer at first, then quiet. Come in. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, still fully dressed, the locket in her lap, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, like she'd spent the whole day fighting not to cry and had mostly won. I'm not here to ask again, Caleb said. I don't want us living in a house where we can't look at each other. Whatever it is, whenever you're ready to tell me, I'll wait. I meant that last night and I mean it now. Clara looked at him for a long moment like she was testing the weight of that promise against every promise that had broken on her before. You really will wait. I've waited 8 years for a lot less reason, Caleb said. I can wait a few more days for something that matters. Something in her face gave way then, not all at once, but enough that she patted the space on the bed beside her, and after a beat of hesitation, he sat. They didn't talk about William that night. They talked about small things. Instead, the calf that was due to drop any day on now, a hen that had gone broody in the wrong nesting box the way Pete snored loud enough to wake the barn cats. It wasn't the conversation either of them needed to have, but it was the bridge back to each other, plank by careful plank. And by the time Caleb finally left her room, the tightness in his chest had eased just enough to let him sleep. The calf came 2 nights later in the worst possible weather breach, and stubborn, and fighting for its life in a stall lit by one swinging lantern. And it was Clara who noticed something was wrong before Pete it did. Clara, who had her sleeves rolled and her arm in past the elbow before Caleb had even finished pulling his boots on. "It's turned wrong," she said, breathless sweat on her brow despite the cold. "I need you to hold her steady. Caleb, right there, both hands, don't let her thrash." "Clara, if that leg snaps." "It won't, trust me." He trusted her. He didn't examine that decision too closely in the moment. There wasn't time. He just did what she told him, held the laboring cow with everything he had, while Clara worked with a calm, brutal focus that left no room for fear, calling out instructions that Pete scrambled to follow. And for 20 of the longest minutes of Caleb's life, the three of them fought together against something that could have gone very wrong, very fast. When the calf finally came loose, slick and gasping and alive, Clara laughed an exhausted, disbelieving laugh, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on her face, and Caleb found himself laughing too. Both of them collapsed against the stall rail, breathing hard, covered in the mess of new life. And it was in that unguarded, ridiculous moment, exhausted and grinning at each other in a barn that smelled like blood and hay, that Clara finally started talking. "His name was William Ashford," she said, quiet, like the words had been waiting a long time for a door low enough to slip through. "We were engaged, back in Ohio, before everything with my father came apart." Caleb went very still, but he didn't say a word. He just listened. "I loved him," Clara said. "Or I thought I did, the way you think you love someone at 20 before you've watched what happens to love when it's tested. His family had money, respectable money. Mine had none. And once my father's debts became public, once the whole town knew the Whitmores were finished, William's mother forbade the marriage. Said no son of hers would tie himself to a family drowning in shame. William didn't fight her." Her voice caught just slightly. "He didn't fight her, Caleb. He apologized and he gave the ring back through his sister because he couldn't even look at me himself. And 3 weeks later, he took a fever and died before either of us ever spoke again." "Clara, I kept the locket because it was the last thing he ever gave me before all of it fell apart. And because I never got to tell him I understood, or that I hated him a little, or that I forgave him anyway. I never got to say anything. He was just gone, and I was left standing in a town that already thought I was worthless, now grieving a man who'd been ashamed to marry me." She wiped her face hard with the back of her wrist. "That's why I answered your advertisement, Caleb. Not because I was hiding from a man who wanted me back. Because I was running from every single person who ever decided my worth for me before I got a say in it." The barn was silent, except for the calf's soft new breathing and the rain drumming steady on the roof. "I'm sorry," Caleb finally said. "I'm sorry I made you carry that alone for even one more day than you had to. You didn't know. I could have asked gentler. I could have given you the time I promised before I ever opened that locket in the first place." Clara looked at him, something raw and unguarded in her face that he hadn't seen since the wedding vows. "You're the first man who's apologized to me for anything in longer than I can remember." Neither of them said what was building underneath that sentence. They didn't have to. It sat between them, warm and dangerous and entirely new, and when Caleb reached out and wiped a smear of dirt from her cheek with his thumb, neither one of them pulled away. They walked back to the house together in the last of the rain's shoulders, bumping, saying nothing. And for the first time since the wedding, it didn't feel like silence born of distance. It felt like two people who had finally run out of walls to hide behind. The days that followed were different, lighter. Caleb caught himself watching for her across the yard just to see her laugh at something Pete said, and Clara stopped flinching every time he asked her a question, like she'd finally decided he wasn't going to use her answers against her. One evening, he took her out past the barn to the cottonwood tree and stood with her in front of 2 small wooden markers he hadn't visited with anyone else in 8 years. "This is Sarah," he said, "and this is our son. We never got to name him." Clara didn't offer platitudes. She just took his hand and stood there with him in the quiet, and that alone told him more about her than 100 conversations could have. "I used to think loving someone new would feel like betraying them," Caleb admitted. Like I'd be erasing what we had. It doesn't erase it, Clara said softly. It just means you've got room for more than one kind of love and a heart big enough to hold it. William would want the same for me, I think, if he'd ever gotten the chance to be brave enough to say so while he still could. They stood there a long while, two people who'd buried different kinds of grief under different trees in different states, finding out they weren't nearly as alone in it as they'd thought. None of that healing reached the ears of Victor Hayes, who by that point had stopped waiting on Caleb's good sense entirely and started spending money instead. 2 counties east, in a rented office above a dry goods store, a man named Sutter, hired at Victor's expense, paid in advance, discreet by trade, sat across a desk from Victor with a folder of notes gathered from 3 weeks of quiet questions in Willow Creek, and one very productive letter sent east to Ohio. Whitmore family's got a colorful history, Sutter said, flipping through his notes. Father drank himself into an early grave owing half the county. Daughter was engaged, once broken off, and not quiet about it either, from what I gathered. Boy died of fever right after. There's talk it wasn't handled real gracefully on either side. Victor leaned back, steepling his fingers, a slow smile spreading across his face. A broken engagement and a dead fiancé. That's the kind of scandal a small gossiping town chews on for years, Mr. Sutter. You planning to use it? I'm planning, Victor said, to remind Caleb Walker that a man who won't sell his land for money might sell it to protect his wife's good name instead. Every man's got a price. Sometimes it isn't written in dollars. It was a plan built on cruelty, dressed up as strategy, and neither Caleb nor Clara had the first idea it was already in motion 2 counties away, folded neatly inside a leather folder, waiting for the right moment to be opened. That right moment, as it happened, wasn't far off. The letter Clara had tucked so quickly into her coat pocket at the post office turned out to be from her younger brother Thomas, and when she finally read it alone that same week, whatever piece she'd found at the cottonwood tree cracked clean down the middle. The family's last remaining acreage, the one patch of Ohio ground that hadn't already gone to creditors, was being seized inside the month unless someone paid off the remainder of their father's debt. Thomas, 16 and desperate, and too proud to say so outright, had written to ask if there was any way at all, his sister could send money. Clara sat with the letter for a long time before she brought it to Caleb, and when she finally did, she braced herself the way a person braces for a door slamming shut. I don't expect you to fix this, she said quickly before he could even finish reading it. I only wanted you to know. I'll write back and tell him there's nothing I can send. We're barely keeping this ranch afloat as it is. I know that I've seen the ledgers. Clara, and I won't ask you to sink money into a farm in Ohio when we've got fences that still need mending and a barn roof that won't survive another bad winter. Clara, Caleb caught her hand, stopping the flood of words. We'll find something. Not everything, but something. Nobody in this house is going to lose the last piece of ground they've got, not while I can help it. She stared at him like she was waiting for the catch, the condition, the price he'd eventually name for kindness, like that. It never came. Why would you do that? She asked quietly. For a family you've never met in a town you have never seen. Because you're my wife, Caleb said, simple as that, like it had stopped being a complicated word between them weeks ago. And because somebody should have stood up for you a long time before I did. It wasn't a fortune he could offer, a modest sum, scraped together from what little the ranch could spare. But it was enough to buy Thomas a few more months, and when Clara sealed the return letter that night, her hands weren't shaking with fear anymore. They were shaking with something closer to hope, and hope for a woman who'd spent most of her life without much of it was a dangerous and wonderful thing to hold on to. The trouble came to town instead of the ranch, the way trouble in Willow Creek usually did, dressed as gossip first before it ever showed its real face. Ruth Denny, of all people, was the one to bring it, though this time, there was no cruelty in her voice, only a strange, careful hesitance that put Clara on edge the moment she heard it. There's a man been through town asking questions, Ruth said, catching Clara outside the church 2 Sundays later, her voice pitched low. Well-dressed, not local. Asked the postmaster about letters coming and going from your address. Asked a few of us about your family back in Ohio. I didn't like the look of him. Mrs. Walker and I didn't like the questions, so I thought you should know. Clara's stomach turned over, slow and cold. Did he give a name? Sutter, I believe. Said he was collecting information for a business matter. Didn't say whose. Clara thanked her and meant it's surprised at how far the two of them had come from flour barrels and sharp smiles, and rode home with her thoughts racing the whole way, arriving before Caleb had even unhitched the wagon. Someone's asking about me in town, she told him. About my family, a man named Sutter. Caleb's face went hard in a way she hadn't seen since the day he'd first laid eyes on Victor Hayes. Sutter, he repeated slowly. That name means something to you. No, but I think I know whose business matter he's collecting information for. They didn't have to wait long to find out. Victor rode onto the ranch that very Thursday. No charming detour about land offers. This time, no pretense of neighborly manners at all. Just a slow, deliberate confidence that told Caleb before a single word was spoken that this visit was different from the others. Caleb, Victor said, dismounting without being invited to. Mrs. Walker, I'll get right to it since I imagine you are both busy people. He pulled a folded paper from his coat, tapping it once against his palm, like a man laying a card on the table he had been saving all along. I know about William Ashford. I know about the broken engagement, the scandal that came with it, the way it was talked about clear across your county back in Ohio. I know your father died owing money to half the town, Mrs. Walker, and I know your family's still fighting off creditors on the last scrap of land they've got left. Clara went white, her hands curling into fists at her sides, but she didn't back down an inch. You had a man dig through my family's grief for gossip. That's despicable, Mr. Hayes, even for you. Maybe, Victor said unbothered, but it's useful gossip, and gossip's currency in a town this size, same as land. I don't much care what you did or didn't do back in Ohio, ma'am. Truth is, I don't think you did anything wrong at all, but I imagine plenty of folks in this valley would enjoy chewing on the story regardless. A scandal follows a woman a long way, especially a beautiful one. People love nothing more than watching someone lovely get knocked down a peg. He turned back to Caleb, his voice dropping into something colder. So here's my offer. One final time, Caleb. Sell me the north parcel. Fair price, same as always. Or I let this story make its way through every parlor and pew in Willow Creek, and you can watch your wife fight the same battle all over again that just about broke her the first time. The silence that followed was the kind that made a man's ears ring. Caleb crossed the yard, slow, deliberate, until he was close enough that Victor had to tip his head up to keep eye contact. You listen to me, Caleb said, quiet and lethal, in a way none of his ranch hands had ever heard from him before. My wife's past is not a bargaining chip, and it sure as hell isn't yours to spend. You want to spread ugly stories about a woman who's done nothing but work herself half to death trying to build an honest life out here. You go right ahead, Victor. But you tell that story with my name standing right next to hers, because I'll stand in the middle of every parlor and every pew in this valley and tell them exactly what kind of man had to dig up a dead fiancé and a grieving family just to threaten a rancher who wouldn't sell him his land. See how that story sits with folks once they hear both halves of it. Victor's easy composure flickered just slightly for the first time since he'd ridden onto the property. You're making a mistake, Caleb. The only mistake I made, Caleb said, was letting you set foot on this ranch even one more time. Get off my land, Victor, and don't come back unless you are bringing a fair offer and leaving my family out of it. This is the last time I ask nicely. For a long moment, Victor just looked at him, calculating, weighing whether the threat still had teeth now that it had been met head-on instead of absorbed in fearful silence. Whatever he saw in Caleb's face convinced him it did not today, at least. He swung back up onto his horse without another word, though the look he threw Clara on his way past carried a promise all its own, cold and unfinished, before he rode off the way he'd come. Clara let out a breath she seemed to have been holding the entire exchange. He's not finished. Men like that never are. No, Caleb agreed, but he knows now he's not dealing with a man standing alone anymore. He turned to her gentler now, some of the fury draining out of his shoulders. You didn't do anything wrong, Clara. Not with William. Not with any of it. I need you to hear that because I don't think anyone's ever bothered to tell you. Her eyes filled, and this time she didn't fight it. You keep saying things nobody's ever said to me before. Maybe it's time somebody started. That night, after Pete and Jed had turned in and the house had gone quiet, Caleb found Clara sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the dark shape of the mountains, and he sat down beside her without asking the way a man does, with someone he stopped needing permission to be near. I used to think surviving was the only thing I was good for, Clara said, not looking at him. Surviving my father, surviving William leaving, surviving the whole town watching me do it. I never let myself think past just getting through the next hard thing. And now, she finally turned to look at him, and in the low porch light, her face had none of the careful armor she'd worn since the day she stepped off that stagecoach. Now, I think maybe I came out here for more than survival. I think maybe I came out here for this. Caleb reached over slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and when she didn't, he tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his hand lingering against her cheek. I didn't marry you for love, he said quietly. I want to be honest about that, same as I've been honest about everything else. But I think I'm falling into it anyway, Clara, whether either one of us planned on it or not. I think I am too, she whispered. Neither one of them closed the last small distance between them that night. It was too new. Too fragile, both of them too aware of everything still unresolved, with Victor circling the edges of their happiness, like a wolf that hadn't given up the hunt. But they sat together until the stars wheeled halfway across the sky, hands folded together on the step between them. And for the first time since either of them had lost someone they loved, the future looked like something worth reaching for, instead of something to simply survive. It was 2 mornings later, with that fragile new peace still settling over the ranch, like the first frost of the season, that Pete came riding in from town at a dead gallop, hat gone face white as chalk, hauling his horse to a stop so hard it nearly threw him. "Caleb," he shouted before he'd even swung down. "Caleb, you need to hear this from me before you hear it from someone else in town." Caleb was already crossing the yard alarm, sharpening every line of his face. "What happened? Is it Victor?" "It's not Victor." Pete's chest was heaving, his eyes darting once involuntarily toward the porch, where Clara had just stepped out at the sound of the commotion. "There's a man in Willow Creek asking for the Walker Ranch by name. Says he's come all the way from Ohio." Pete swallowed hard, like the next words cost him something to say. "Says his name is William Ashford, and he's asking to see his fiancée. Orchestrated dramatic twist vor William song lai se young moilam mini climax for twist lone. Orchestrated dramatic twist vor William song lai se young moilam mini climax for twist lone." Caleb didn't move for a long moment. The words hung in the yard like smoke that wouldn't clear, and behind him he heard the porch step creak as Clara came down slow, one hand pressed flat against her stomach like she'd been struck. "That's not possible," she said barely above a whisper. "William is dead, Pete. I got the letter myself. His mother wrote it in her own hand." "I don't know what to tell you, ma'am." Pete's voice was gentle now, careful the way a man talks around a wound he's afraid of making worse. "I saw him myself standing right there at the hotel desk, asking Mr. Feeney by name where he might find the Walker Ranch. Fair-haired fellow, well-dressed, spoke like Ohio money. Said his name clear as day. Said he'd come a long way to find you." Clara's knees seemed to go soft beneath her, and Caleb crossed the yard in 3 fast strides and caught her elbow before she could stumble. "I've got you," he said, low, steady, even though his own chest felt like it had been cracked open with a maul. "I've got you, Clara. Just breathe." "He's dead," she said again, like repeating it might make it true. "I grieved him. I carried his locket across an entire country because I grieved him." "Maybe it's a mistake," Caleb offered, though even as he said it, he didn't believe it, and neither did she. "Maybe it's not him at all. Maybe it's some fellow with the same name." Clara looked up at him, and there was something terrible and hopeful and furious all tangled together in her eyes. "Or maybe," she said, "somebody lied to me." Nobody said anything to that. The silence stretched long enough that even Pete looked down at his boots, and Caleb felt something cold uncoil low in his stomach. Not just fear of losing her, though that fear was there sharp and immediate, but fear of what it would do to her to learn that the grief she'd carried across 2,000 miles, the grief that had shaped every guarded, careful thing about her since the day she stepped off that stagecoach, might have been built on a lie somebody told her on purpose. "I need to see him," Clara said, finally straightening some of her old ear and sliding back into her spine even through the shock. "I need to hear it from his own mouth." "Clara, I'm not asking your permission, Caleb. I'm telling you what I have to do." Her voice cracked just slightly at the edges. "But I would like you there with me if you're willing. I don't think I can walk into that hotel and hear whatever he's about to tell me standing alone." Caleb didn't hesitate. "You won't be standing alone. Not for this. Not for anything far as I'm concerned." They rode into Willow Creek inside the hour, the wagon moving faster than Caleb usually pushed it. Clara's hands knotted together in her lap the entire way, her eyes fixed straight ahead, like she was bracing for a blow she couldn't yet see coming. Caleb kept glancing sideways at her, wanting to say something that would help, and finding nothing that felt big enough for the moment. "Whatever he tells you in there," he finally said, as the first buildings of town came into view. It doesn't change what you and I have built. I need you to know that going in, I'm not scared of a ghost showing up breathing Clara. I'm only scared of what it costs you to look at him again. Clara reached over and gripped his hand, once hard, grateful and terrified in equal measure. Thank you for saying that. I mean it. But I have to go in there and find out anyway. The hotel lobby went quiet the moment they stepped through the door. Not the ordinary quiet of a slow afternoon, but the particular charged quiet of a room that already knew something was about to happen and was holding its breath to watch it. And there, rising from a chair near the window, was a man Clara hadn't laid eyes on in over a year. A man she'd wept over, a man whose name was engraved beside the word forever in gold. She'd carried across a continent. William Ashford, thinner than she remembered, older. Around the eyes, very much unmistakably alive. Clara. His voice broke on her name, and for a moment neither one of them moved, the whole room suspended around two people staring at each other across an impossible gap neither had ever expected to close. God in heaven, Clara, it's really you. I've been searching for months. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, and for a second Caleb thought she might collapse entirely, but she caught herself against the doorframe, instead staring at William like she was trying to convince her own eyes they weren't lying to her. You're supposed to be dead, she finally said, and her voice came out raw, furious, and wounded both at once. I got a letter, William. Your mother's own hand. She told me you'd taken the fever and passed not 3 weeks after everything with the engagement fell apart. I mourned you. I carried your locket to another country, and I mourned you. William's face crumpled, guilt washing over it so plainly that even Caleb, standing tense and watchful a few feet away, felt a flicker of something other than jealousy for the first time since Pete had ridden in with the news. I did take the fever, William said. Nearly died of it. In truth, I was unconscious, the better part of 3 weeks, and when I finally woke, my mother told me you'd already left Ohio, that you wanted nothing more to do with our family, after everything that happened, that you'd made your feelings plain, and there was no changing your mind. He dragged a hand down his face and his voice cracked. I believed her, Clara. God help me, I believed her because I was too weak and too ashamed of how I'd behaved to question it. It wasn't until 4 months ago, going through her correspondence after she passed, that I found the letter she never sent, the one where you'd written, asking after me, begging to know if I was even alive. She'd hidden it. She hid all of it on both sides and let us each believe the worst about the other, so the scandal would simply die quiet with no loose ends to embarrass the family name. Clara made a sound that was half sob, half furious, laugh, disbelief, and rage colliding somewhere behind her ribs. She let me grieve you for a year. She let me believe you died still ashamed of me. I know, William said. I know, and there is no part of that I can undo, no matter how far I traveled to try. I've spent 4 months tracking you across half this country, Clara, because I owed you the truth face to face, even if it changed nothing between us. Even if you never forgive me for not fighting harder the first time, when it still could have mattered. Caleb watched the woman he'd fallen in love with stand in the middle of that hotel lobby and absorb a betrayal. A full year deep, watched her hands shake and her breath come short, and every protective instinct in him strained towards stepping between her and one more thing, trying to hurt her. But he made himself stay still because this wasn't his moment to fill. This one belonged to her. You should have written the moment you found that letter, Clara said finally, her voice steadying even as tears finally broke loose and ran unchecked down her face. You should have written the second you knew, instead of spending 4 months chasing me across 3 states while I built an entire life believing you were in the ground. You're right, William said quietly. I was a coward once already, Clara. When it counted most, and I told myself finding you in person instead of hiding behind another letter was some kind of penance. I see now it was probably just more cowardice dressed up different. His eyes moved for the first time past her shoulder to Caleb, standing close, protective, unmistakably a husband and not a stranger. Something shifted in William's face, understanding landing hard. You're married? I am, Clara said, and there wasn't a flicker of hesitation in it, even through the tears. This is Caleb Walker, my husband. William nodded slowly, grief and something like relief tangled together on his face in a way that told Caleb this man, whatever his failures, hadn't ridden into town planning to steal another man's wife. Then I owe you an apology too, Mr. Walker, for the chaos I've clearly dragged into your home along with my own guilty conscience. Caleb studied him a long moment, feeling out the shape of a man he'd been ready to hate an hour ago and found something more complicated than hatred waiting instead. You didn't lie to her, he said finally. Your mother did. That's not nothing in my book. But I'll tell you plain, Mr. Ashford, Clara's had enough people in her life decide things for her, decide her worth for her, decide her grief for her, without asking. Whatever you came here to say, you say it to her honest, and then you let her decide what happens next. Not your mother, not you, her. It was, Clara would think later, one of the kindest and fiercest things anyone had ever said on her behalf, and she reached for Caleb's hand without thinking, needing the solid warmth of it more than she needed air just then. News of William Ashford's arrival tore through Willow Creek faster than any fire ever could. By the time Caleb and Clara stepped back out onto the boardwalk, half the town had already gathered at a careful, curious distance, and Ruth Denny's steady ally these past weeks, but a woman who could still smell a scandal, 3 counties off, hurried over with her hand pressed to her chest. Is it true, she breathed, the dead fiancé alive right here in Willow Creek? Mrs. Walker, are you quite all right? I'm fine, Mrs. Denny, Clara said, and meant it more than she expected, to standing there with Caleb's hand still wrapped around hers. It's a long story and not nearly as scandalous as it's about to sound by supper time, I imagine. Well, Ruth glanced between Clara and William, who'd followed them out looking pale and uncertain, clearly unused to being the center of a town's collective gossip. The whole valley's going to be talking of nothing else for a week. She wasn't wrong. And 2 streets over, watching the little crowd gather from the shaded porch of the land office, Victor Hayes lowered his newspaper just enough to take in the scene with the calm, delighted attention of a man who'd just been handed a gift he hadn't even had to pay for. Well, he murmured to no one in particular, folding the paper slow and deliberate. Isn't that interesting? He didn't approach right then. Men like Victor rarely rushed a good opportunity. They let it ripen first. But that evening, while Clara sat with William in the hotel's small parlor, Caleb close by, arms crossed, silent but present, unwilling to leave her alone with the weight of this conversation. Even for a moment, Victor was 2 doors down at the land office, dictating a letter to his lawyer in Helena, asking a very specific, very careful question about Ohio marriage contracts, breach of promise law, and whether a formal engagement broken under fraudulent circumstances and never legally dissolved might carry any weight against a marriage entered into elsewhere, while both parties believed the other deceased. It was a long shot, Victor knew that, but a long shot dressed up right and whispered in the right ears didn't need to win in a courtroom. It only needed to plant enough doubt to make Caleb Walker desperate enough to finally sell. Back in the parlor, William sat across from Clara with his hat turning slow in his hands, working up to something that had clearly been sitting on his chest the whole ride from Ohio. I need you to know, he said, that I didn't come here hoping to win you back. I want to be honest about that, even if it costs me whatever's left of your good opinion of me. I came because you deserve the truth, plain and whole, no matter what you chose to do with it. Seeing you happy, seeing the way that man looks at you like you hung the stars yourself, that's more than I have any right to be disappointed about. I gave up my claim on you the day I let my mother's letter go unanswered. I know that now. Clara studied him a long moment, feeling the ghost of an old grief settle finally quietly into something she could set down instead of carry. I forgive you, William. Not because you deserve it handed to you easy, you don't, not entirely, but because I've spent enough of my life letting old wounds decide who I get to become next. I won't do that anymore. Not for your mother's lies and not for my own grief either. That's more grace than I earned, William said quietly. Probably, Clara agreed with the faintest, tired smile. Take it anyway. Caleb, watching from the doorway, felt the last of his tension finally loosen. Whatever storm this man had ridden into their lives, it wasn't the storm he'd braced for. But storms in Willow Creek had a way of arriving in pairs, and the next one was already gathering 2 streets over with a lawyer's letter and a patient, calculating smile. It found them 3 days later, delivered by a boy from the land office directly to the ranch, a single folded paper that Caleb read standing in his own yard with his jaw going tighter by the sentence. What is it? Clara asked, watching the color drain slightly from his face. It's from Victor's lawyer, Caleb said, voice flat with disbelief. He's questioning whether our marriage holds legal weight given that your engagement to William was never formally legally dissolved before you left Ohio, filed under something called breach of contract, given the circumstances of his mother's interference. He's suggesting there could be grounds to contest it, land included. Clara snatched the paper from his hands, reading it twice, her face shifting from disbelief to fury in the space of a breath. This is absurd. William himself has already said plainly there's no claim between us. This is Victor manufacturing a weapon out of my grief. I know that, Caleb said. You know that. But a judge in Helena, who doesn't know either one of us, might see a technicality worth dragging through a courtroom for months, and Victor's got money enough to make that drag as long and as public as he pleases. He's not trying to win Clara. He's trying to bleed us dry with doubt and legal fees until I sell just to make it stop. Then we fight it, Clara said immediately. Iron sliding back into her spine, the same iron that had stared down Ruth Denny and Victor, both without blinking. We get William to put something in writing himself, a formal statement witnessed, that he relinquishes any claim that the engagement was broken through no fault of mine, that there's no contract left standing between us. We take that straight to whatever Judge Victor thinks he's going to charm. Caleb looked at her furious, unbroken, already 3 steps ahead of the very trouble that had just landed on their doorstep, and felt something fierce and grateful twist through his chest. I married a woman who backs down from nothing, he said. I keep forgetting to be surprised by that. Don't forget, Clara said, already moving toward the house to fetch paper and ink. It's about to come in useful. William, when they rode into town to find him that same afternoon, agreed without a moment's hesitation. Fury of his own written plain across his face at learning how Victor intended to use the wreckage of his own cowardice as a weapon against people who had done nothing but try to survive it. I'll sign whatever you need, he said, already reaching for the pen Clara offered. Witness notarized however formal you need it made. I came here to give you back your peace, Clara, not hand some land-grabbing opportunist a new way to take it from you. He paused, pen hovering over the paper, something steadier settling into his face than Caleb had seen from him yet. For what it's worth, Mr. Walker, I'd have been a lucky man to marry her myself once if I'd had the spine for it. Seems only right that a man who does have the spine for it gets to keep her instead. It was as close to a blessing as the strange tangled circumstances allowed, and Caleb accepted it with a short, firm nod, some of the old wariness between them finally settling into something like respect. The signed statement went out by rider to Helena within the day, but Victor, when word reached him that his gambit had been outmaneuvered so quickly and so thoroughly, didn't retreat quietly the way a lesser man might have. He showed up at the ranch himself 2 evenings later. No lawyer's letter in hand this time, just his own simmering anger barely held in check behind a smile gone thin and brittle. Clever, he said, dismounting without invitation the way he always did, getting the old fiancé to sign away his claim so fast. Didn't think you had that kind of resourcefulness in you, Mrs. Walker. You underestimated me from the very first afternoon you rode onto this ranch, Mr. Hayes, Clara said, standing on the porch beside Caleb, neither one of them flinching. I'd have thought you'd have learned better by now. Maybe I have. Victor's eyes cut to Caleb, something harder and less patient than his usual charm bleeding through. But I'll tell you both plain, since subtlety's clearly wasted on the two of you, I don't lose Caleb. Not to a man who couldn't keep a herd solvent without a mail-order bride bailing him out of bad decisions, and not to a woman who married her way out of her family's disgrace. I'll find another angle. There's always another angle with people who've got as much to hide as you two apparently do. We don't have anything left to hide, Caleb said, stepping half in front of Clara, without quite meaning to, an old instinct, sharp and new by everything they'd survived together these past weeks. That's the thing you never understood, Victor. You've spent this whole fight at assuming shame was a lever you could pull on us. It isn't. Not anymore. Victor's jaw tightened, and for one long moment, something genuinely dangerous flickered behind his composed exterior. Not the practiced menace of a businessman used to winning through pressure, but the raw fury of a man realizing, perhaps for the first time in years, that money and reputation weren't going to be enough to get him what he wanted. We'll see, he said low and swung back up onto his horse. This valley's got more secrets in it than the two of you, Caleb. I intend to make use of every single one I can find. He rode off into the gathering dusk without looking back, and Clara let out a slow, unsteady breath once he was finally out of earshot. He's not finished, she said quietly. Whatever he meant by more secrets, he's already planning his next move. Let him plan, Caleb said, though there was a tightness in his own voice that told her he wasn't nearly as unbothered as he wanted to sound. We've weathered worse than Victor Hayes' threats these past weeks, Clara. We'll weather whatever he throws next. But that night, long after the house had gone quiet and Clara had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep beside him, Caleb lay awake staring at the ceiling, turning Victor's parting words over and over in his mind, more secrets than the two of you, and found himself circling back unbidden to a conversation he'd nearly forgotten in the chaos of the past few days. A conversation from years ago with his own father about the North Parcel and the water rights, and a boundary dispute that had never quite been settled the way everyone in town assumed it had. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself Victor was simply grasping, throwing out threats with no real weight behind them, a cornered man swinging wild. He told himself that all the way until sleep finally took him, and he was still telling himself that 3 days later, when a rider he didn't recognize showed up at the gate asking for him by name, carrying an old yellowed survey map and a question about a boundary line that Caleb's own father had sworn on his deathbed was settled fair and square 40 years before. Orchestrated narrative escalation, voi twist lon sungdot dindim. Orchestrated narrative escalation, voi twist lon sungdot dindim. The rider gave his name as Elias Cobb, a surveyor's assistant out of Bozeman by his own account, and he sat astride a tired horse with a leather map case slung across his back like a man who'd been carrying it a long way and wanted badly to set it down. "Mr. Walker," he asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew the answer and wished he didn't have to say what came next. "I've got some paperwork here concerning your north boundary. Old survey markers. I was told you'd want to see it before anything got filed formal with the county." Caleb felt Clara's hand find the small of his back, steady before he'd even fully processed the words. "Told by who? Man paid my fee. Didn't ask his name past what was on the bank draft." Cobb shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable. "But the survey itself is real, sir. I didn't draw it up crooked. I just measured what's there and matched it against the county's original filing from 1851. And what's there," Caleb said slowly, "doesn't match what my father always claimed." Cobb pulled the rolled paper from his case and held it out, not quite meeting Caleb's eyes. "According to the original survey markers I found, sir, the property line runs about 400 yards south of where your fence currently sits, which would put your whole North Parcel water access included inside land that technically was never platted to the Walker claim at all." The silence that followed had weight to it, the kind that pressed down on a man's chest like a held breath that wouldn't let go. "That's not possible," Caleb said, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. "My father fought for that boundary his whole life. He told me on his deathbed it was settled fair and square." "Could be it was settled," Cobb said carefully, "and could be it was settled wrong, sir, 40 years back, and nobody ever caught it because nobody ever had reason to look close. I'm not saying your father lied to you. I'm saying old surveys get made by men with dull pencils and bad eyesight sometimes, and the ground doesn't care whose intentions were good." Clara stepped forward before Caleb could respond, her voice sharp enough to cut through the fog settling over him. "Who paid you, Mr. Cobb? You said a man paid your fee. I think you know exactly who, and I think you rode out here uneasy about it, or you wouldn't be sitting on that horse looking like you'd rather be anywhere else in the territory." Cobb's jaw worked, and for a moment it looked like he might simply spur his horse and ride off rather than answer. But something in Clara's stare, steady, unflinching, the same look that had backed down Ruth Denny and stared straight through Victor Hayes without blinking, seemed to pull the truth out of him anyway. "I don't have proof," he said finally. "Just a bank draft signed by a lawyer's office out of Helena. In a lawyer's office, don't pay a surveyor's fee out of the kindness of anybody's heart. I did the work honest, Mr. Walker. I want you to know that much. But I'll admit I've got a bad feeling about who wanted it done and why." Caleb's hands curled slowly into fists at his sides. He didn't need Cobb to say the name. He already knew. "Victor Hayes," Caleb said low and flat. Cobb didn't confirm it outright. Professional caution, maybe, or simple fear of a man with Victor's money and reach, but he didn't deny it either, and that silence was confirmation enough. "I'd get a second survey done if I were you," Cobb said instead, gathering his reins. "Independent one. Somebody with no stake either way. If the line really does sit where I found it, you'll want to know before it gets filed against you in a courtroom instead of out here in your own yard where you've still got room to fight it fair." He rode off before Caleb could ask anything more, leaving behind a rolled survey map that felt in Caleb's hands heavier than anything he'd carried in years. That night, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with his father's old strongbox pulled down from the attic, working through decades of yellowed papers by lamplight, while Clara sat across from him, sorting through the same pile with the same relentless focus she brought to everything. Your father kept meticulous records, she said, unfolding a brittle document with careful fingers. Receipts going back 30 years, correspondence. If there was ever a formal settlement of that boundary, it should be in here somewhere. If Victor's lawyer already knows to file against it, Caleb said, rubbing his eyes, then he's had somebody digging through county records for weeks, maybe longer. This wasn't a decision made on the spot after William showed up. This has been coming a long while. Which means he's patient, Clara said, and thorough, and willing to spend real money to get what he wants. She looked up at him, something fierce settling into her expression. Which means we have to be more patient and more thorough and just as willing to fight for what's ours. It was past midnight when Clara's fingers finally stilled on a folded document near the bottom of the box, her breath catching audibly enough that Caleb looked up from his own pile immediately. Caleb, look at this. It was a formal county filing dated 1851, signed by the original surveyor and countersigned by 2 witnesses. A settlement agreement between Caleb's grandfather and the previous owner of what was now Victor's land, establishing the boundary exactly where Caleb's fence currently stood. Water rights explicitly included, filed and recorded with the Territorial Land Office in Helena. This is it, Caleb breathed, hands shaking slightly as he took the paper from her. This is the original settlement. If this is real, it's real, Clara said. Look at the seal. That's the Territorial Office stamp, not a county copy. Your grandfather kept the original instead of leaving it on file, which means if Victor's lawyer went digging through the county records looking for something to twist, he might not have found this at all because it was never there to find. Relief crashed through Caleb so hard, his hands actually trembled. And for a moment, he simply sat there staring at 80-year-old ink like it was the answer to every prayer he hadn't let himself say out loud in weeks. We need this authenticated, Clara said, already moving practical even in triumph. Notarized, verified against the original filing markers Cobb mentioned. We take this straight to the land office in Helena before Victor's lawyer files anything, and we make sure there's no room left for doubt. Caleb looked at her sharp, tireless, already 3 steps ahead of the crisis that had nearly buckled his knees an hour before, and felt something settle deep in his chest that had nothing to do with land or water rights at all. I don't know what I'd have done, he said quietly, if you hadn't been sitting across this table with me tonight. You'd have found it eventually, Clara said, but I'm glad I didn't have to let you find out alone. The trip to Helena took the better part of 2 days, Clara insisting on coming along despite Caleb's half-hearted protest that the ranch needed tending, and by the time they returned, the original settlement, formally re-recorded, a certified copy in hand, the land office clerk and assuring them in writing that any competing claim on the Walker North parcel would now be measured against an ironclad, territorially authenticated boundary. The ground beneath Caleb's feet felt solid again, for the first time since Cobb had ridden up with his rolled map and his uneasy conscience. It didn't stay solid for long. Victor's lawyer filed anyway 3 days after the Walkers returned, as if the timing itself was meant as a taunt. A formal boundary dispute lodged with the county court citing Cobb's original survey as grounds for reconsideration and requesting an injunction preventing the Walkers from drawing water from the disputed section until the matter was settled. He knows he's going to lose, Caleb said, reading the filing on the porch steps with Clara close beside him. Pete pacing behind them like a man who wanted badly to hit something. He has to know. We've got the original settlement notarized and refiled. This isn't a case he can win. He's not trying to win in court, Clara said quietly. He's trying to choke us dry while it drags through the system. An injunction on water access right now, with the herd needing it and the season what it is. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. All 3 of them understood exactly what a summer without water access meant for a working cattle ranch court case or no court case. How long does an injunction like that usually run? Pete asked. Weeks, Caleb said grimly. Maybe longer if his lawyer knows how to stall it. Long enough to hurt us bad, even if we win everything in the end. It was Jed of all people who spoke up next, hat in his hands, looking between the 3 of them, with the careful hesitance of a young man about to say something he wasn't sure was his place to say. My uncle sits on the county water board, he said, not the court. The board that actually oversees who's got it access while a dispute's being sorted. Might be worth asking him whether an injunction like that has to shut off access completely, or whether there's room for a temporary sharing arrangement while the case moves through. Worth a try anyhow. Caleb looked at him surprised. You never mentioned your uncle sat the waterboard. Didn't seem the sort of thing that comes up in conversation, boss, but it's coming up now. That small, unexpected lifeline turned into 2 days of careful negotiation. Clara sitting in on every meeting with a sharpness that impressed even the crusty old board members who'd clearly expected a rancher's wife to stay quiet in the corner. And by the end of it, they'd secured a temporary shared access arrangement that would keep the herd watered while the legal question sorted itself out in court, a small, hard-won victory in a fight that was clearly far from over. Victor didn't take the setback well. He showed up at the ranch himself that same week, arriving without warning in the gray hour, just after supper, his composure thinner than Caleb had ever seen it, some of the practiced charm finally cracking to show the desperate, calculating man underneath. Clever again, he said, dismounting, hard enough that his horse sidestepped irritated. The waterboard, I didn't account for that. You didn't account for a lot of things, Victor, Caleb said, standing on his own porch with Clara at his side, the two of them a unified front that had stopped being anything Victor could easily rattle weeks ago. You didn't account for my grandfather keeping the original settlement instead of leaving it on county file where your lawyer could go digging. You didn't account for my wife knowing how to read a boundary filing better than most men who've spent their whole careers doing it. And you sure as hell didn't account for the fact that this town stopped believing every word out of your mouth the way they used to. Something in Victor's face went sharp and ugly, the mask slipping fully for the first time since Caleb had known him. You think this is over because you dug up an old piece of paper and charmed a waterboard out of a temporary favor I own half the businesses in this valley, Caleb? I've got money in 3 banks and friends in the territorial legislature. You think a rancher and his mail-order bride are going to outlast me in a fight this size? I think, Clara said, stepping forward, her voice cool and utterly unafraid, that you've spent this entire fight assuming money and friends in high places mean you get to win no matter what's true and what's not. But truth's got a stubborn way of catching up to men like you eventually, Mr. Hayes. You forged a shadow of doubt out of an honest surveyor's discomfort and a piece of paper you hoped nobody would ever find. We found it, and every dirty trick you try after this one, we'll find that too. Victor stared at her a long, cold moment, and Caleb saw something dangerous pass behind his eyes. Not the calculated patience of a businessman anymore, but the raw, wounded fury of a man watching a plan he'd invested months and real money into come apart in front of him, piece by piece, at the hands of 2 people he'd never once respected enough to consider capable of beating him. You'll regret standing in my way, he said low, and it didn't sound like a bluff this time. Both of you. He rode off into the dark without another word, and this time nobody on that porch felt any relief watching him go. He meant that, Pete said quietly once the sound of hoofbeats had faded. That wasn't posturing, boss. That was a man deciding he's got nothing left to lose by playing dirty. Caleb nodded slowly, his jaw tight. Then we don't give him any room to. But rooms had a way of opening up anyway. And the very next afternoon, while Caleb and Jed were out checking the herd near the contested boundary line, they found it 3 of their cattle down throats, cut clean, left where they'd fall in a message too deliberate to be mistaken for wolves or rustlers passing through. Jed went white. Boss, I see it. Caleb's voice had gone flat and cold, the kind of calm that sat right on top of a fury too large to let loose all at once. Get Pete, get the sheriff, and don't touch anything until he's seen it exactly like this. Sheriff Boone rode out within the hour, a heavy-set, unhurried man who'd kept the peace in Willow Creek for going on 15 years, and had learned in that time to be slow to accuse and slower still to let a powerful man's money change what his own eyes told him. Clean cuts, Boone said, crouching by one of the dead animals, his expression grim. Not an animal attack, not rustling either. Nobody took the meat or the hides. This was done to send a message, Caleb, plain and simple. Victor, Caleb said, it wasn't a question. Can't prove that, Boone said carefully. Not yet, but I'll tell you this much. I've had my own suspicions about that man for longer than I care to admit, and I don't much like coincidences that line up this neat right after a boundary dispute turns ugly in his favor. Go the wrong way. He straightened, dusting off his knees. I'll ask around town, quiet like. See if anybody saw riders out this way last night. But Caleb, you keep your temper in check till I've got something solid. A man in your position, angry as you've got every right to be, could do something rash that lands him in worse trouble than the one he's already fighting. Caleb nodded tightly, though the fury sat in his chest like a coal that refused to cool. And it was Clara arriving on horseback just as Boone was leaving, who found him standing over the dead cattle with his hands clenched at his sides and his eyes fixed somewhere far past the horizon. Caleb! She dismounted fast, crossing to him, her hand finding his arm. I heard from Jed. I came as soon as I could. He killed them to send me a message, Caleb said, voice tight and low. 3 good animals dead for nothing, just so I'd know how far he's willing to go. Then we make sure he knows exactly how far we're willing to go right back, Clara said, which is further and smarter and without ever giving him the satisfaction of watching us break. Caleb looked at her, some of the wild fury in his chest settling just slightly at the sight of her steady and unshaken beside him, the same way she'd been steady through every single thing this valley and this man had thrown at them since the day she stepped off that stagecoach. How are you always so calm, he asked, when everything keeps trying to knock us down? I'm not calm, Clara admitted. I'm furious. I just learned a long time ago that fury only wins if you let it think for you instead of the other way around. That steadiness got tested harder than either of them expected. 2 nights later, when Clara woke to the smell of smoke thick enough to choke on, and Caleb already bolting from the bed, shouting for Pete and Jed before he'd even fully cleared the doorway. The old hay barn, not the main barn, thank God, but close enough that the wind could carry the fire across in minutes if they didn't move fast, was already fully engulfed. Orange light licking up into the dark sky, and the 4 of them spent the next desperate, screaming hour, hauling water and beating back flying embers, dragging what livestock they could reach clear of the smoke, working with a raw, terrified focus that left no room for anything but the next bucket, the next breath, the next animal pulled free. By the time the flames finally died down to smoldering ruin, the hay barn was a total loss, but the main barn stood, the house stood, and every animal that mattered had made it out alive. A small, exhausted mercy in the middle of a disaster that could have been so much worse. Clara sat on the porch steps afterward, soot streaked across her face, her hands raw and shaking with the last of the adrenaline, and Caleb sank down beside her, equally wrecked, both of them staring at the smoking ruin like survivors of something they still didn't quite believe they'd walked away from. That wasn't lightning, Caleb said once he'd caught enough breath to speak. There's been no storm in 3 days. No, Clara agreed quietly. It wasn't lightning. Sheriff Boone arrived at first light, walking the perimeter of the burned barn with a grim, careful thoroughness. And it was Pete who found it, a half-burned rag near the tree line, still faintly reeking of coal oil, tossed aside by someone in too much of a hurry to properly hide his tracks. Somebody set this deliberate, Boone confirmed, holding up the rag with 2 fingers, his expression darker than Caleb had ever seen it. I'll be honest with you, Caleb. Dead cattle's one thing. A man can talk himself into believing that's just meanness or rustlers or bad luck dressed up ugly. But arson on an occupied property with people sleeping 50 yards away, that's attempted murder dressed up as property damage far as the law is concerned, and I intend to treat it exactly that, serious. You think it's Victor, Caleb said. I think, Boone said carefully, that I've got a rag smelling of coal oil, 3 dead cattle with clean-cut throats, and a wealthy neighbor who's been trying to force you off this land through every legal and half-legal means available to him for going on 2 months now and getting nowhere. I think when a man like that runs out of clever ideas, sometimes he starts reaching for ugly ones instead. But I'll say it again, I need proof, not just a strong hunch before I ride on to Victor Hayes' property and start making accusations a judge is going to want backed up solid. Then we get you proof, Clara said, standing, some of her exhaustion burning away into something harder and more determined. Whoever set that fire didn't do it alone and didn't do it for free. Somebody paid them, same as somebody paid Cobb for that survey. Money like that leaves a trail, Sheriff, if you know where to look for it. Boone studied her a long moment, something like respect settling into his weathered face. You're not wrong, ma'am. I'll start asking around the banks. Man spending that kind of money quiet tends to leave marks even when he thinks he's being careful. It took 4 more days of careful, exhausting work, Boone quietly canvassing the banks and the saloons, Pete and Jed rebuilding what they could of the burned structure while keeping watch through the nights, Clara and Caleb barely sleeping, jumping at every unfamiliar sound before the break finally came. and it came from the last place any of them expected. Elias Cobb rode back onto the ranch alone, hat in his hands, looking like a man who hadn't slept properly in a week either. I heard about the fire, he said, before Caleb could even ask what brought him back. And I heard about the cattle. And I want you to know, Mr. Walker, that survey I ran for you was honest work, same as I told you. But I didn't sleep right the whole ride back to Bozeman, knowing what kind of man I'd taken payment from to do it. He swallowed hard. I kept the original bank draft. Name on it, account number, everything. I told myself I was keeping it in case I ever needed to prove my own work was clean if this ever went sideways. Seems it's gone about as sideways as it can go. He held out a folded paper and Caleb took it with hands that weren't quite steady, staring down at Victor Hayes' own signature, stark and undeniable, authorizing payment for a survey specifically intended to challenge the Walker boundary claim, dated weeks before William Ashford had ever ridden into Willow Creek, weeks before any of Victor's public offers to buy the land, proof that this whole campaign had been calculated and premeditated from the very start. This is enough, Caleb said, voice rough. This is more than enough. I figured it might be, Cobb said. I'm sorry it took me this long to bring it. I told myself it wasn't my business what a man did with an honest survey once it left my hands. I don't believe that excuse anymore, not after cattle and a barn. Clara stepped forward and took his hand in both of hers, something fierce and grateful in her eyes. Thank you, Mr. Cobb. You didn't have to ride all the way back out here. No, Cobb agreed, but some debts a man's got to pay whether he has to or not. Sheriff Boone, when they brought him the signed draft that same evening, went very quiet for a long moment, turning it over in his hands like he was weighing exactly how much trouble it was about to cause and how satisfying that trouble was going to feel. This, he said finally, combined with what I've already turned up at the bank in town is enough for a warrant. Not for the boundary dispute, that's still civil court's business, and you've already got the stronger claim there regardless. But conspiracy and destruction of property, and I intend to press just as hard as the law allows on whether that fire counts as attempted harm to persons given how close it burned to where you were all sleeping. He looked up at Caleb and Clara, both something grim and resolute in his expression. I'll ride out to Victor's place, myself first light tomorrow. I'd appreciate it, Caleb, if you and your wife stayed clear of it and let the law handle what comes next. You've both fought hard and fought smart this whole ugly business. Let it end with a badge doing the arresting, not a rancher doing something he can't take back. Caleb wanted badly to be the one who rode onto Victor's land and watched the man's composure finally completely shatter. But he looked at Clara at the exhaustion and the steadiness, both written plain across her face, and understood that the fight they'd actually won, the one that mattered most, had already been fought and won right here in this house, and every moment they'd refused to let Victor Hayes turn them against each other or break either one of them alone. We'll stay clear, Caleb said. Just make sure it's done right, Sheriff. Make sure there's no way for a man with his money to slip out from under this. I intend to, Boone said. You've got my word on that? That night after the sheriff had ridden off and Pete and Jed had finally turned in, exhausted from the long days of rebuilding, Caleb and Clara sat together on the porch steps in the quiet dark, the burned skeleton of the hay barn still smoldering faintly at the edge of the yard, a scar on the land that would take a season or more to heal. It's almost over, Clara said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. Whatever Boone finds tomorrow, whatever happens with the arrest, Victor doesn't have anything left to threaten us with. Not the land, not my past, not even the fire, not once that draft goes in front of a judge. Almost over, Caleb echoed, wrapping his arm around her, some of the tension of the past weeks finally cautiously beginning to loosen in his chest. I keep thinking about everything that's happened since that stagecoach pulled in. William showing up, Victor's lawyer, the fire. I keep waiting for the next thing to knock us sideways. Maybe there isn't a next thing, Clara said. Maybe we're allowed to just be happy now for a while. Caleb wanted more than almost anything to believe that was true. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head and let himself hope, just for that one quiet moment on the porch steps, that the worst of it really was behind them. He was still holding on to that hope the next morning when Jed came sprinting up from the road, breathless, face white with an urgency that killed whatever peace either of them had managed to find overnight. Boss, you need to come quick. It's the sheriff. He rode out to Victor's place at first light, just like he said, and Jed had to stop and drag in air before he could finish. Victor's gone, Caleb. Cleared out sometime in the night. House empty, safe cracked open, and half his hired men gone with him. Boone thinks somebody must have tipped him off before the warrant ever got signed. Clara's hand found Caleb's arm, gripping hard, the fragile hope of the night before collapsing into something colder and far more dangerous. If Victor's running, she said slowly, that means he's desperate. And desperate men don't just disappear, quiet Caleb. Not men like him. Not after everything he's already been willing to do to keep from losing. Orchestrated climactic finale voy twist confrontation, vaket thukman man. Orchestrated climactic finale voy twist confrontation, vaket thukman man. Caleb didn't waste time being afraid. He saddled his horse before Jed had even finished catching his breath, and Clara was right behind him, boots already laced, refusing outright when he opened his mouth to tell her to stay behind. Don't, she said, cutting him off before the words even fully formed. Don't you dare tell me to sit safe in this house while you ride out into whatever Victor's got planned. I've earned the right to stand beside you in this fight, same as every other one, Caleb Walker, and I intend to use it. He didn't argue. There wasn't time, and some part of him, the part that had spent 8 years believing safety meant standing alone, had finally learned better than to try. Sheriff Boone met them on the road into town, his face grim, 3 deputized men already mounted behind him. Victor's hideout's not hard to guess, he said without preamble. Old line shack up near the county boundary, out past Miller's Ridge. Belonged to his father before him. If he's running instead of fighting outright, that's where a man like him goes to ground while he figures his next move. Then that's where we go, Caleb said. You and Mrs. Walker are staying back at the edge of town, Boone said firmly. I mean that, Caleb. I've got a warrant and deputized men. This is law business now, not yours to settle personal. Caleb wanted to argue. Every instinct in him wanted to ride straight to that line shack and finish this himself. But Clara's hand found his arm, again steady grounding, and he made himself nod instead. We'll wait at the church, Clara said. But Sheriff, you find him, you bring him back alive and standing trial. Don't give him the satisfaction of dying a martyr in this valley. Let the whole town watch him answer for what he's done in a courtroom in the daylight, where everyone can see exactly what kind of man he really was underneath all that charm. Boone studied her a moment, something like admiration flickering behind his weathered eyes. That's about the coldest, smartest kind of justice I've heard asked for in a long while, ma'am. I'll do my level best. He rode off with his men at a hard pace, dust rising behind them, and Caleb and Clara turned back toward town to wait, through what felt like the longest afternoon of either of their lives. They didn't wait alone. Word had already spread the fire, the dead cattle, the warrant Victor's sudden disappearance, and by the time Caleb and Clara reached the churchyard, half the town had gathered there too, drawn by the same anxious need to be near something solid, while the real danger played out somewhere over the ridge. Ruth Denny was among them, wringing her hands, and she came straight to Clara the moment she spotted her. Is it true? Ruth asked. Victor Hayes behind all of it, the fire, the cattle, that dreadful lawyer's filing. It's true, Clara said, every bit of it. Ruth's face went through something complicated. Shame maybe for every unkind word she'd ever whispered about Clara in that store, mixed with a fresh fury, now redirected at a man the whole valley had once respected, without question. I'll tell you this, Mrs. Walker. I've said unkind things about you since the day you stepped off that stagecoach, and I'll own that plain because it's true and you deserve the honesty. But I never once imagined the real danger in this valley was sitting in that big house on the hill all along, smiling at us over church socials, while he planned to burn a family out of their home. She reached out awkward but sincere and squeezed Clara's hand. I hope they bring him back in chains. And I hope you know there's not a soul in this town who'll doubt your word again. It was, Clara thought, an apology 8 weeks in the making, and she found she didn't need to make Ruth suffer for it any longer than she already was. The waiting stretched into evening, every distant sound of hoofbeats sending a fresh jolt of fear through the gathered crowd, until finally, as the light began to fail, riders appeared on the road, Boone in the lead, his deputies flanking, and between them, wristbound, sitting a horse, with none of his usual composure left Victor Hayes. The crowd went utterly silent as the procession passed through town, and Victor, to his credit or his ruin, didn't bother hiding his fury anymore. His eyes found Caleb and Clara standing together at the edge of the churchyard, and something ugly and defeated twisted across his face. This isn't over, he called out, voice cracking with a rage that had nowhere left to go. You hear me, Walker. This isn't... It is Victor, Boone said flatly, giving the reins a hard tug. It's been over since you set that first fire. You just hadn't figured it out yet. They led him past and the crowd parted around the procession like water around a stone. Nobody offering him so much as a word of sympathy, and Caleb felt something in his chest finally completely unclench for the first time in what felt like months. But Boone reined up briefly before continuing on toward the jailhouse, and the look on his face told Caleb the story wasn't quite finished unspooling yet. There's more, Boone said low, just for the two of them. We found the money trail while we were searching the shack. Bank drafts, correspondence, and a name I think you're both going to want to hear before it hits the rest of the town. Clara's stomach dropped. Who? Boone hesitated, clearly not relishing what came next. Mr. Abernathy, the postmaster. Seems he's been reading more than delivering your mail this whole time. Mrs. Walker passing word to Victor whenever anything interesting came through, including that letter from your brother, including the arrival of your first letter about William. Victor's have been paying him for information since near about the week you got off that stagecoach. Clara went very still, betrayal settling cold and sharp behind her ribs. He's the one who told Victor about William being alive, about the postmark, about the handwriting. That's how Victor knew to send a man digging into my past before William ever even reached town. Looks that way, Boone confirmed grimly. I'll have him in a cell by morning too. Man's got no more business handling this town's mail than Victor's got owning this valley. It was Caleb realized the twist neither of them had seen coming. Even after everything, the quiet, unassuming postmaster, a man Clara had thanked politely a dozen times over these past months, feeding Victor every private piece of her life, the whole while turning her most vulnerable moments into ammunition, for a man who wanted nothing more than to break her down until Caleb had no choice but to sell. How long, Clara asked quietly, has he been doing this? Since near the beginning, from what we found, Boone said. I'm sorry, ma'am. I know that's a hard thing to sit with. Finding out someone you saw as harmless was part of it the whole time. Clara nodded slowly, and Caleb watched her absorb one more betrayal with the same steady resilience she'd carried through every single one before it, though. This time he saw the toll it took, the way her shoulders dropped just slightly before she straightened them again by sheer force of will. I think, she said finally, I'm done being surprised by how far people will go for money and spite. I think from now on I'd just like to be surprised by kindness instead. It's been a good while since that's had a turn. Caleb pulled her into him, right there in front of half the town, not caring who watched and held her, while the last of the day's fear finally drained out of her in a long, shuddering breath. Court came 3 weeks later in Helena, and Caleb and Clara rode in together to see it through William Ashford's signed statement and Cobb's bank draft laid out plain before a judge who didn't take long to see exactly what kind of man had sat across from him. Victor's own lawyer, faced with evidence of arson, animal cruelty, bribery, in a boundary dispute built on manufactured doubt, could do little more than argue for leniency in sentencing, and even that argument found small purchase against a judge clearly unimpressed by a wealthy man's assumption that money excused everything. Victor was sentenced to 8 years in the territorial prison, his assets seized to cover restitution for the fire, and the cattle his land put up for auction to settle what remained of his debts. Abernathy, for his part, lost his postmaster's commission entirely and was fined heavily for the bribery, though the judge showed him what small mercy he could on account of his age, in the absence of any direct hand in the violence itself. Clara sat through the entire proceeding with her spine straight and her chin level, the same posture she'd carried off that stagecoach on the very first day. And when the verdict was finally read, she didn't cheer, didn't cry, just let out one long, slow breath, like a woman finally setting down a weight she'd been carrying for months without ever quite realizing how heavy it had gotten. It's finished, Caleb said, taking her hand as they walked out of the courthouse into the Helena afternoon. All of it. Victor Abernathy, the boundary dispute, the debt on your father's land back in Ohio. Thomas's letter said the payment cleared last week, didn't it? The farm's safe. Safe, Dom. Clara confirmed, something soft and disbelieving in her voice. For the first time since I was 14 years old, Caleb, I don't have a single thing left hanging over my head. Not my father's debts, not William's ghost, not Victor's threats, nothing. How does that feel? Clara considered the question seriously, like it deserved real weight instead of an easy answer. Strange, she admitted. Good. Mostly good. I think I've spent so long bracing for the next hard thing that I don't quite know what to do with my hands now that there isn't one waiting. Caleb laughed low and warm and pulled her hand through his arm as they walked. I could think of a few things to do with your hands, starting with letting them rest a while. You've earned that much, Clara Walker. She smiled at the sound of her married name in his mouth, still new enough after everything they'd survived together to feel like a small private gift every time he said it. The ride back to Willow Creek took 2 days, and somewhere in the quiet, easy hours of the second afternoon with nothing left chasing them and nothing left to fear, Caleb found himself telling her things he'd never said out loud to another living soul, the specific weight of grief he'd carried for 8 years, the guilt he still sometimes felt for laughing again, for wanting again, for building a life that didn't have Sarah standing at the center of it anymore. I used to think if I let myself be happy, he admitted, it meant I'd stopped loving her, like joy and grief couldn't share the same house. They can, Clara said softly. I think that's the whole secret nobody tells you until you've lived through enough loss to find out for yourself. Grief doesn't leave to make room for something new. It just learns to sit quiet in the corner while the new thing grows up around it. Caleb reached over and took her hand, resting both of theirs on his knee, and for a long while they rode in a silence that had nothing lonely left in it at all. Back at the ranch, life settled into something neither one of them had quite dared to imagine that first tense afternoon on the Willow Creek platform. The hay barn was rebuilt bigger and better than the old one, the whole town turning out for the raising in a single loud, generous day of hammering and laughter that Clara later called, only half joking, the nicest welcome party she'd ever gotten in this valley. Victor's seized land went up for auction that same fall, and Caleb, with Clara's sharp eye running every number twice, put in a modest, careful bid on a portion of it bordering their own north parcel, expanding the Walker Ranch for the first time in a generation, this time on ground with no shadow of doubt hanging over the deed. Pete took it into calling Clara boss, half-jokingly by winter, a title that started as teasing and settled somewhere along the way into something that sounded a good deal more like respect. Jed, who'd once told her flatly to leave the tack to the men spent that same winter asking her opinion on breeding stock without a trace of the old resentment left in his voice. Even Ruth Denny showed up more than once with a fresh baked pie and an offer to finally teach Clara that star quilt pattern, the two of them becoming, against every early odds, something like real friends. William wrote twice more from Ohio, once to confirm Thomas and the rest of Clara's family were settled and safe, the farm debt cleared for good, and once simply to say he hoped she was as happy as she deserved to be, a closing line that read like a man, finally fully at peace with a door he'd once left cruelly ajar. Clara answered both letters kindly, honestly, and without an ounce of the old grief clinging to the words anymore. It was a quiet evening in early spring, almost a full year to the day, since that stagecoach had pulled into Willow Creek, that Caleb found Clara out by the cottonwood tree, standing where Sarah and their unnamed son were buried, a second smaller stone, now resting beside the first two, one Caleb had commissioned, without telling her, engraved simply with the words, "In memory of all we carry, so that what comes next can be carried lighter." "You did this?" Clara asked, tears already gathering. "I did." Caleb came to stand beside her. "I wanted somewhere for both our griefs to sit together. Sarah and the baby, your father. William, in a way, the man you thought you lost, even if he came back different than either of us expected. I figured if grief was going to keep living quiet in the corner of this family, it might as well have a proper place to rest." Clara turned into him, burying her face against his chest, and he held her there a long while, the two of them standing together in front of markers that no longer felt like separate sorrows, but like something shared. Something that had, against every hard mile it took to get here, brought them to exactly this spot, exactly this life, exactly each other. When she finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, there was something different in her expression. Nervous, almost in a way Caleb had rarely seen from a woman who'd stared down Victor Hayes without blinking. "I have something to tell you," she said. "I've been waiting for the right moment, and I don't think there's ever going to be a perfect one, so I suppose this is as good as any." Caleb felt his heart pick up. "Clara, I'm going to have a baby?" She said the words coming out in a rush, like she'd been holding them back so long they'd built up pressure behind her teeth. "Come autumn, the doctor in town thinks. I wanted to tell you here of all places because I wanted Sarah to be part of this moment too somehow. I wanted you to know this baby isn't replacing anything. It's just more love this house gets to hold. Caleb stood frozen for a long moment, emotion crashing through him too fast and too full to immediately find words for, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out rough and thick. A baby, he repeated like he needed to say it out loud to believe it. Clara, he laughed, disbelieving, joyful tears standing plain in his own eyes now. That's everything. That's more than I ever let myself hope for again. He pulled her into him, laughing and crying both at once, spinning her once before catching himself, careful now, protective in a whole new way that hadn't existed in him 10 seconds before. I love you, he said, the words coming easy and certain, nothing careful or measured about them at all. I don't think I've said that plain enough, often enough, but I love you, Clara Walker. I loved you before I let myself admit it, and I love you more with every single thing we've survived together. I love you too, Clara said, laughing through her tears. Even after you stood on that platform a year ago and said the single worst first sentence any bride's ever heard from her husband. Caleb groaned, pressing his forehead against hers. You're never going to let that go, are you? Never, Clara confirmed, grinning. I intend to remind you of it on our 50th anniversary, Caleb Walker, in front of every grandchild we managed to collect between now and then. He kissed her, then slow and certain under the cottonwood tree, with the spring evening settling soft around them, and somewhere behind them, up at the house, lamplight glowed warm in the windows, and somewhere further out, the herd moved easy across land that finally fully belonged to nobody's fear anymore. The baby came in October, a healthy girl with her mother's sharp green eyes, and Pete swore up and down from the very first week her father's exact same stubborn chin. They named her Sarah Grace Sarah for the woman whose memory had shaped Caleb into a man capable of loving again, instead of hiding from it Grace for the mercy Clara had learned, slow and hard-won, to extend to everyone in her life who'd ever failed her, including in the end herself. Caleb held his daughter for the first time on the porch steps where he and Clara had once sat holding hands under a sky full of stars, both of them too afraid yet to name what was growing between them, and he found himself thinking back unbidden to that very first moment on the Willow Creek platform, the stagecoach doors swinging open, his own foolish, startled words tumbling out before he'd had a single second to think better of them. My wife can't be this beautiful, he murmured now, looking down at Clara, where she sat beside him, exhausted and glowing, and holding their daughter's tiny hand in her own. I said that to you the very first day, like it was some kind of insult, like beauty was a problem I hadn't budgeted for. You did, Clara agreed, smiling up at him, warm and unguarded and entirely finally at peace. It was the worst first impression a man's ever made on his own bride. I know better now, Caleb said quietly, watching her, watching their daughter, watching a whole life he'd once believed himself entirely unworthy of, entirely incapable of building again. It was never really about how you looked standing on that platform. It was that I couldn't yet see who you actually were, a woman strong enough to rebuild a stranger's whole broken life, patient enough to wait out every wall I put up between us, brave enough to fight a man with more money and more power than either of us, and still come out the other side, gentle enough to hold our daughter like she's the only fragile thing left in this whole hard world. Clara's eyes filled, and this time the tears that fell were the easy kind, the kind that came from a heart too full, rather than one still bracing for the next blow. You gave me a home, she said softly. Not just this ranch, Caleb. A home. The first place in my whole life where I got to be exactly who I am without anyone deciding my worth for me first. And you gave me my life back, Caleb answered. I thought surviving alone was strength. You taught me the real strength was letting someone stand close enough to catch you when surviving alone finally became too heavy to carry by yourself. They sat together as the evening settled deep in gold across the valley, their daughter sleeping soft between them, the ranch stretching wide and safe, and entirely their own in every direction. No more shadows circling the boundary line, no more secrets hidden at the bottom of a locked trunk, no more grief carried alone in silence, because admitting it felt too much like weakness. Caleb Walker had once believed a wife was nothing more than a practical arrangement, a working partnership, built to keep a lonely ranch from falling into ruin around him. He had asked for someone plain, someone quiet, someone who wouldn't ask anything of him he no longer believed he had left to give. Instead, fate had sent him a woman so extraordinary, so relentlessly, fiercely alive that she had rebuilt not just his ranch, but the whole broken architecture of his heart, one stubborn, hard-won day at a time. And every single time he looked at her now, exhausted and radiant, on that porch step with their daughter cradled between them, he understood at last that her greatest beauty had never been the one he'd stared at in shock on that stagecoach platform. It was the beauty of everything she had chosen again and again to bring into his life, instead of walking away from it, and that more than any land, any fortune, any grand declaration a lonely rancher could ever have written down on a single sheet of paper, was the truest, most unshakable love story Willow Creek would ever tell.